Good morning, everyone. Please take your seats if you haven't already. Lovely to see such a full house. It's funny how no one ever sits in the front row, though. It's all right. I'll just lie across the front row. It's fine. I'll take up five seats. Whai whea te kete mataranga, fill the basket of knowledge. This is what we will be doing today at the annual launch of the Better Futures Report, brought to you by Kantar in partnership with my organisation, the Sustainable Business Council. Ata Māori e, nau mai, haere mai. I'd like to give acknowledgement to any tangata whenua in the room, including Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, on whom this land of this building resides. Also wanted to take a moment to pause and reflect on the recent passing of Rod Oram and those who were close to him. Ko Jay taku ingoa ke Sustainable Business Council ahau e mahi ana. I am Jay and I work for the Sustainable Business Council as the head of ESG. We are a CEO-led community of 130 businesses committed to a future where business, people and nature thrive. And if you can't remember that, it's on the banner over there. This includes responding to what consumers say they want to see more of. I have been watching/living for Taylor Swift's Eras Tour on Disney+. Stay with me. And I sat there thinking, man, this is like watching a concert about the messages related to better futures. Because the takeaways are the same. Without giving away what you'll hear from Jace today, the report tells us consumers want businesses to do more of substance and say more of substance. This relates to Taylor Swift and business in 3 ways. To do more, there are few singer-songwriters more hardworking than Ms. Swift. She's a powerhouse. She sticks to her principles and delivers a great night that meets her consumers, exceeds her consumers' expectations. And consumers have the same expectation of business to deliver an exceptional sustainable product or service in line with their principles. Say more. No one is more vocal than Taylor Swift. She rocks a 3.5-hour set with 10 costume changes, I counted. And she's been quite vocal politically recently too. And consumers expect businesses to be vocal as well. And this means businesses communicating progress, not perfection, and grounding their communication in evidence, again, like Taylor Swift. Her songs are very evidence-based because she bases each of them on her sometimes checkered dating history and the evidence of the ups and downs in that. When prepping for this launch, Nikki, who was here in the audience somewhere, Nikki Wright, the CEO of Wright Comms, had a challenge to us. She said, so what? Consumers have been saying this stuff for 15 years now. What is the opportunity for business? So I've been reflecting on this, and I think the opportunity is access to markets that we'd be shut out of if we didn't do this stuff, access to consumers who care about this stuff, access to capital to fund this stuff. The opportunity to do more, to say more of substance is huge. And it was with that I hand over to my Kantar colleagues to talk you through the latest findings. Ngā mihi kia koe.
Ngā mihi nui kia koutou tēnei rā. Welcome everyone to the Better Futures Report 2024, and thank you, Jay, for starting off with an opportunity to open our minds to how New Zealanders are feeling about the world through the lens of sustainability. It's hard to believe that this is the 15th year in a row that we have published the Better Futures Report in New Zealand. And I've been reflecting on the journey from no interest at all to a highly engaged audience across a wide range of industries, sectors and geographies. Plus, we have inspired Kantar to develop a global consumer insights practice dedicated to sustainable transformation. Now, it never ceases to amaze me the number of people who I speak to who say they reference this unique piece of work to help strengthen the narrative for creating positive change and positive sustainable change with business, with government, with NGOs, the media and the community at large. So I have to thank the SBC for their partnership to ensure that we reach these audiences with insights that are meaningful, and helpful. It's also very interesting to see how New Zealanders have evolved in terms of their views of sustainability. We no longer rely on our primitive instincts to act as consciously as consumers. We are becoming increasingly sophisticated with our knowledge, and we are actively seeking information and proof to support our needs to do the right thing. But therein lies the challenge. Who do you believe, and how do you make sustainable decisions in a world of information overload? And when 84% of people want to make sustainable choices and only 27% are actively changing their behaviour, it signals that there's a real need for this guidance to be better. And here's a fun fact. For all the consumer insights work that Kantar did last year, only 5% of it related to consumer views of sustainability. Now, we know that sustainability alone does not equal success. But what we do know is that brands that communicate credible, sustainable messages, and they carry more potential to contribute to brand equity, and that is where the value lies. So that's what today is about. We will further build our learnings about New Zealand attitudes and behaviours towards sustainability, and then we're going to deep dive into the challenges associated with brands and businesses around communicating to enable sustainable consumer action. So I'd like to extend our real gratitude to Nikki Wright from Wright Communications and Daniel Street from DLA Piper for contributing to the panel discussion following this presentation. But for now, I am going to hand over to my esteemed colleague, Jason Kate, who has worked hard with the team at Kantar to bring you the 2024 Better Futures report.
Morena tato, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces, and if any of you are here for the first time, then an even warmer welcome to you. It's great to have you here. Now, as Sarah just hinted at, we're going to be telling a story in largely three parts this morning. We are going to start off by touching on the state of play. And here, actually, we can take the greatest advantage of the fact that Better Futures is 15 years old, and we can talk about, our understanding of how things have changed over time in terms of the hearts and the minds, but also the actions of New Zealand consumers. And a lot of this content will be familiar. It's an evolution of a lot of trends that we've been seeing. But after that, we're going to change gear a little bit, and we're going to deep dive more into the question of what drives the reputation of businesses that are seen as sustainability leaders versus those that are seen as less so, and then get even sharper in that conversation with looking specifically into greenwashing and green hushing as phenomenon as well. So, with that in mind, let's dive into the first section around the state of play and sustainability. Now, some of you may remember or be familiar with this broad framework here. What this is a segmentation of New Zealand consumers, and it's built on two criteria. You'll see down the bottom, we understand people's values, the extent to which they care about sustainability in their lives, but then that's also crossed with the extent to which I take actions against it. And by understanding those two things together, what it does is it produces four broad segments of the population, and within that, it's the group on top right that we describe as the eco-actives that really are the ones of greatest interest. They are the hero in our story because they really are the bellwether of progress towards sustainable transformation from a consumer perspective. So, understanding them in that way, it's really positive to see that between 23 and 2024, we've seen a positive shift, an increase in 3% to now 38% of the population of the eco-active audience. But actually, that's part of a broader story. It's not just what's happening, because if you look at the growth in the eco-believers segment beside it, actually what that shows you is that those two segments are both our high values segments. So what that tells us is that New Zealanders' aspirations, their values, their hopes and dreams to live a more sustainable and ethical life continues to evolve year on year. So that is obviously a really good thing. But another thing we need to recognise when we think about a segment like ecoactives that have now reached 38%, is that that's actually getting really quite large. And when you get to that size, of course, you are no longer the niche, smaller, fringe premium extracting segment that you were once. Now, there was a time, of course, and a number of marketers will remember this time, that was true. That was absolutely true. But once you're on a trajectory like ecoactives are within the population now, yes, there are some statistical skews in the profile of who these people are. If you find an ecoactive in the street, yes, they are still slightly more likely to be financially comfortable, female, and highly educated. But I think the broader truth, which is the key message I'd like everyone to take, is that frankly, it doesn't matter where you look. If you look across age groups, education levels, income levels, or locations, you can find a decent cohort of ecoactives everywhere. Another really interesting thing this touches on is the idea when we talk about values and actions, and if you were here last year, you would have remembered us talking about this in quite some depth, is the idea of how and why sometimes my actions don't always match my values. And we talked a lot about the impact that the cost of living is having upon that. And while I think it's fair to say that the peak intensity of what we were seeing 12 months ago has diminished somewhat, it does seem to have solidified into a sense of a new normal in terms of how households are now adapting to their constrained budgets. And we see some really interesting examples of this as it relates to people's willingness and readiness to pay the green premium for different things. So if you have a look at those first two behaviours there, minimising the number of car journeys you take, but also making use of off-peak energy pricing, those are interesting because those are good for the planet, but they're also good for me. They save me money and they also benefit the greater good. And as a consequence, we find more New Zealanders doing those now than we did 12 months ago. If we look at the bottom two behaviours, which are actually an interesting contrast, because both of these, in terms of buying free-range, non-intensively farmed products, but also choosing appliances that have better Energy Star ratings and therefore cost more, both of those are better for the planet, but they're worse for me. And so as a consequence, we're seeing less people do them than we were 12 months ago. So you're seeing some pretty clear evidence of what we're phrasing as the new frugality, which really has solidified within households' behaviours. And with that in mind, again, it's not surprising at all to see that once again, the cost of living has come up as the issue of greatest concern among New Zealand consumers, along with a number of other socio-economic issues such as the protection of children, access to healthcare, access to housing, and indeed violence. And it's an insight in itself, the fact that within those top 5 issues to New Zealanders, all those are socio-cultural and socio-economic by their nature. Actually, our priority environmental and sustainability issues, which are outlined over the right of the slide, none of them actually make the top 5 of concerns to New Zealanders. Now, that's interesting in itself, but more interesting, I think, is if you look within those sustainability concerns where we're starting to see the suggestion of some change, some increasing diversity of concern in the way that people are navigating and understanding what environmental care and sustainability means for them. Because we're definitely seeing a continued priority around the health of waterways. We are seeing a little bit of growth around the issue of microplastics, which is certainly more in the public domain and conversation than they were previously. But alongside those, we see some interesting changes. So if you drop down to the fourth statement there, the impact of climate change, you start to see that's actually dropped off a little. And even further down, the impact of extreme weather events, which understandably reached its peak 12 months ago and has actually dropped off quite significantly, which talks very strongly to that issue of salience that we spoke to last year. As long as it's in people's minds, then it starts to impact your behaviour, but it has quite a short half-life as well. And so we're seeing some really interesting changes go on there. And if you start to look at the same listing in terms of those issues which are the most important to me overall, but also the most important environmental sustainability issues, but cut by our 4 sustainability segments, then cast your eye down to the bottom left of the table. Because what that shows you is that even among the eco-actives, we see microplastics in waterways as priority issues over what would have been a more classic emblematic cause for them, such as climate change, which is actually no longer in their top 5. And so, we're seeing some interesting changes. Climate change is still the most top of mind, most spontaneously recalled and answered environmental issue when you ask people spontaneously. But there's also some quite strong suggestion, I think, here that there's an increasingly diverse set of concerns here for people to cope with beyond climate change, because while the number of New Zealanders that believe that are concerned about the impact of climate change has shown a decline in the last year, that 3% is actually 6% among the eco-actives. And that in itself, as I was describing them, they tend to be quite leading indicators of what is happening for the rest of the sustainability population. So that, again, is quite interesting to see. Now, this chart is a really good example of benefiting, obviously, from the fact that we've been running this program for a long time. As you can see, there's a long set of historical data here. And one of the other points we've been tracking for a very long time is a slightly different question, which is the level of commitment to living a sustainable lifestyle. And again, for those of you who were here last year, you may remember that there was a really notable nosedive in the level of commitment that was shown. And this raises a couple of different topics. The first is, of course, well, it's fantastic to see that it has rebounded to a degree in 2024. So obviously that is what you would hope to see and want to see, and we've seen it, so that's great. But it's also produced, certainly from a researcher's and I would argue a practitioner's point of view as well, kind of an interesting conundrum in that what we saw last year is, again, that same growth and aspiration. More people were seeking to do the right thing and live a more sustainable and ethical life. Yet actually, because of the cost of living crisis, what happens is their stated level of commitment plummeted. And so we realised really quickly that if these two things aren't moving together, then there's actually a little bit more going on under the hood of commitment than just maybe understanding it in a very simple fashion. So we wanted to really dig into this more this year. And so what we did is that we started to understand commitment this time in 2 different ways. Now you'll see over the top of this table, we're expressing commitment here as a state of mind. It's like psychological commitment. And there's a scale here on which people can sit from being completely passionate about something to not being interested at all. But of course, we also need to understand that by the other dimension of commitment, which is behavioural commitment. I'm doing everything I can. I do a lot, I do a few things, I do very little, I actually don't do anything at all by choice. And by understanding the consumer population on those 2 different expressions of commitment, we start to see some really important and interesting patterns. Now, the first one that I'll draw your eyes to, if you haven't already noticed it yourself, is the fact that we're quite interested. So 61%, that's a decent number of people that are saying, yes, I'm quite interested in sustainability. But cast your eye down that column, and you'll see that the vast majority of people that are interested are clearly not doing everything that they could do. So it's your classic expression of your values action gap. My actions, my behaviours are not fully in alignment with my values and my aspirations. And so that, more than anything else, I think is a very, very clear statement of opportunity for the business community. We're not pretending that it's simple. We're not pretending that it's easy to convert values into actions, because there are lots of real barriers and frictions between those two things. However, looking at this from a strategic level, if you consider the fact that it is the role of businesses in society to provide the goods and services that enable consumers to live the life that they aspire to, then this continues to be surely one of the largest opportunities that continues to stand in our midst. The other thing that is really important to understand by looking at this is that we have quite a significant proportion, the 22%, that are saying we can take it or leave it. That's actually not the eco-skeptic. That's the eco-nonchalant, if there was such a terminology for that. It's like, well, yeah, I'm not out there, spreading weird theories about things, but neither do I particularly buy it, and neither do I particularly care that much. I'm just not that engaged. And actually, so that starts to give us, I think, a bit of a sharper perspective on this as a challenge than perhaps we would have got by simply saying, yeah, there's 10% eco-dismissers. Because we're asking slightly different questions here, so we get a slightly different perspective. So some really interesting and important challenges that I think this raises for us. And even when we look at the same analysis through the perspective of the eco-actives only, which is what we're looking at in this slide, we see essentially the same challenge. That although there's a high number of people that claim to be quite interested or quite passionate about sustainability, and of course it's the eco-active, so the weight of the numbers is veering more towards the left, as you would expect, the point is the same. The vast majority of people are not living the lives that their values aspire to. And so the core business opportunity that exists there remains. And so if this is as significant a business opportunity as it certainly appears to be, I think it's worth taking a bit of time to think about how these same consumers actually perceive and understand businesses, because they're looking to you to help them close that gap. So let's start moving into that area now. So we'll touch on this topic of what we're describing as sustainability reputation, specifically of businesses and brands. And to do that, we're going to use a slightly different framework this time from the one I just showed you. We're still talking about actions, but we're crossing actions here by responsibility. So what that means is that we're going to understand the level of responsibility that exists for different groups like businesses and government and media and NGOs, and then measure that against the level of action that they are taking. And so have a look at the slide, because I think it shows us some really interesting lessons. First of all, that XY line that goes from bottom left to top right, what that represents is basically the points at which my level of responsibility and the actions I'm taking are equal, which means basically you are meeting your obligations as a member of society. However, what I'm sure you've already noticed is that for nearly all the parts of society that we're understanding here, they are all below the line, and none more so below the line than businesses and brands, where there is a 28% gap between the proportion of New Zealanders who believe that you are responsible for addressing environmental issues and the actual level of action you are taking. That's quite a significant gap. And when we measure that same question in relation to community and social challenges, we see a similar finding. The gap itself is not as large here. It's 20. It's gone from 28 down to 20. And actually, this becomes more of a challenge for government than businesses. But generally, if you look at the pattern across those two issues, then we're getting a very, very clear statement from consumers that actually, I don't think businesses are doing everything they could or should do relative to their obligations. But this again produces quite an interesting conundrum, because while consumers are saying this about the business community en masse, we also know that there are a lot of very well established examples of businesses and brands in New Zealand that are seen as sustainability leaders. And if any of you have seen this chart before in previous years, you will recognise a lot of very familiar names in here. There is the occasional change where we might get one or two large businesses in New Zealand that drop in or out of the second tier, which is more than 50% of New Zealanders believe you're a sustainability leader, or indeed the top tier, which is more than 60% of New Zealanders believe you're a sustainability leader. But generally speaking, it's a pretty consistent group. And so it's a really important question that I think needs answering, is that what is it about these types of companies? What is it that they're doing right? And in some cases, what is it that they're doing not right? But what determines perceptions of sustainability leadership when actually consumers seem to have this lingering cynicism and mistrust about business in general? So that's a task to which we turned our attention in this study. And the way we did it is by investigating the perceptions of sustainability leadership for a selection of 20 major businesses. And you can see it's these businesses on the slide there. And for each of them, we asked consumers how they understood that business and brand to be performing on 8 key criteria. And those criteria you will see listed down the right. And by asking that question in a certain way, we can then understand which of those leadership criteria are having a higher impact versus a lower impact on whether or not I think you are a sustainability leader. And so we can get some pretty clear direction from looking at this, because you can see that the highest impact statements are producing goods and services of value to the environment and society, being transparent, having an active voice, and also aligning with my values as consumers. These are the things that make more of a difference to perceptions of sustainability leadership than others. But you can get even more insight from this when you start to understand what's high impact, low impact, which in this chart is on the bottom axis. So what's on the right is high impact, what's on the left is lower impact. But crossing that by the way that consumers believe businesses are performing. Okay, so that's your vertical axis on this. And so the part of a chart like this you would want to draw your eyes to is the bottom right quadrant, because that shows you the things that are important, the things that are high impact, but it's the places where businesses are perceived as performing less. So these are the greatest opportunities that exist for the business community to enhance their credentials, be more trusted, be more well rated among consumers in terms of what you're delivering to. And you can see there are some pretty clear findings down there. It's around having an active voice. There's quite a lot in that word, having an active voice. The transparency around your organisation's performance, aligning with consumer values, but also the way that we treat our employees. So if you're looking for some guidance around, gee, what can I do? What can I do to be on that top leaders list? Or what can I do to cut through some of that mistrust and cynicism? Actually, we're seeing some pretty clear guidance on those issues and actions that will make more of a difference to your ability to do that. And positively, we also saw across those 20 different businesses and sectors that we investigated, there are pockets of really positive performance as well. We certainly saw some strong performance on some high impact issues around communicating the good things that they do. There are some businesses in New Zealand that do that very well, about making the products and services that value environment and society, about giving back and supporting where it matters, but also representing people similar to consumers in their community. So communicating with me in a way that I can relate to as an individual. And so we're getting this very clear clarion call from our consumers to say, hey, we want to hear more. We want to hear more actively, and we want to hear more transparently. Those are two good words, I think, to keep in your mind, more actively and more transparently. And importantly, we know that when you do that, it makes a significant difference. And the reason I'm saying we know that is because as being part of Kantar, we're lucky to be in a position where globally we are tracking creative communications by the thousands globally every year. And so we understand the impact that that has upon brand equity. So when we talk about brand equity, we understand it in three ways. We understand that a strong brand possesses three key qualities. They're meaningful, they're different, and they're salient. You think of them when you're entering that category. They're top of mind for you. And we can see that when a brand effectively communicates a sustainability message, it has a measurably positive impact on my assessments of you being both meaningful, but even more so, being different and distinct from other businesses that are trying to do the same thing. So it's really interesting. They want to hear from us. When we talk to them, and we talk to them well, then we know it works. But we've got this fascinating situation where that if you look at the percentage of branded communications globally that have a sustainability message, in 2019, it doubled. From 2019 to 2020, it went from 3% to 6%, and it has stayed there since. It has stayed there since. In fact, it's dropped slightly. It's now at 5% of all branded communications globally have a sustainability message, despite the fact that consumers are crying out for more trustworthy communication from you. So therefore, again, it kind of sets up an obvious question. What's holding us back? Why aren't we doing it? And so to talk about greenwashing and green hushing, I think is timely and appropriate. And we're not pretending that greenwashing is the only thing that exists that is challenging our reputation as business and brands, but it is certainly one. So it's worth investigating more. And one of the first interesting things we see when we want to understand the issue of greenwashing and green hushing is by looking at an Asia-Pacific regional study that was done between Kantar and Dentsu. And it was very interesting because what it found was that it's actually the marketing department within all of the internal divisions of a large corporate. It was actually the marketing department that lagged behind the other internal divisions in terms of driving the sustainability agenda within that business. Less than procurement, less than legal, less than others. And when you think about it, for not very long, that has some pretty clear implications if that's the department that is responsible for messaging our consumers. But we also know that it's not just at the divisional level, internal divisional level. It also exists at the governance level. And a shout out to Alec and the team at KPMG with whom we did a project last year that touched on this question of what were the barriers to sustainability transformation at the governance level. And all of these quotes are from New Zealand non-executive directors or director-adjacent sustainability managers, all of which were telling us the same thing, that fear of greenwashing is a real barrier to going forth and telling our story more often or more readily. And there is good reason. There is good reason for that caution. Because if you look at New Zealanders' perceptions around the level of trust and understanding of businesses' messages, it's a pretty negative picture. And not only is it negative in its own right, but we also now have the benefit of global benchmarks to measure a couple of these statements against, which tell us that actually, even in global terms, New Zealanders are quite mistrustful and cynical about what businesses are telling them within their communications. So, cynicism and mistrust is there. We can't deny that it's there. And then within that, we've got the more specific issue of greenwashing as a phenomenon. And globally, we know that on average 52% of consumers claim to have been greenwashed. And what we mean when we say that is that I have seen or heard false or misleading claims around a brand's environmental credentials. It's basically the definition we're working to. 52%. And it would be really comforting and nice to think that that's going to go away. It will just naturally seep away over time. But of course, when you look at the age distribution of that 52%, we realise very quickly that the absolute opposite is true. Okay? An 18 to 24-year-old is almost twice as likely as a 55 to 65-year-old to claim to have been exposed to greenwashing. So this is not an issue that is going away quickly. Okay? These are your consumers of tomorrow, very soon. And neither is this simply an issue that is restricted to a couple of categories or a certain part of the economy, because it's very tempting and obvious to think, oh, well, okay, well, this is something that just a few carbon-intensive industries would do. This is just transport and energy and agriculture and things like that. But again, that's not true. If you look across a really broad range, and this is Australian data we're looking at here, look across a broad range of different categories, the number of consumers of that category who claim to have been greenwashed is frighteningly consistent and pretty high. And even when we get down, as I said, there's a lot of categories in this study, even when we get right down to the bottom, even among the lowest categories like pet food and alcohol, you're still looking at an incidence of 1 in 3 consumers who claim to have received false or misleading information. And there's another really interesting data point which we can match up with that. So this is from the consumer side, but let's look at the same issue from the businesses side. In March last year, the Australian Consumer and Commerce Commission, like our ComCom, they ran an internet sweep, which is kind of like an unannounced audit of 247 different businesses' websites in Australia, and reached the conclusion upon their findings that 57% of them were identified as having made concerning claims around their environmental credentials. So when you look at 57% of businesses and you look at 52% of consumers, you put those 2 points together and you're getting a sense for the scale of the issue. And it's pretty significant. Those are some pretty big numbers in terms of incidence of a problem. But size is not necessarily a problem in itself unless there is risk. So what is the risk? We need to understand what the risk of these actions are. And there's a couple of different ways we can look at this, of course. So let's start by looking over the left. What is the risk from a legal perspective? So we know that in the last 3 years, the 3 years to January 2024, there were just under 120 complaints made to the Commerce Commission in New Zealand relating to environmental sustainability. Now, interesting, that's down on the average. That probably would have been about an average of 60 per year. In previous years, it's down to about 40 per year now, just under. But really, interestingly enough, out of those 117 claims, none of them have resulted in fines. 2 of them have resulted in compliance meetings, and in all fairness to ComCom, actually 2 of them are still ongoing investigations. Now, the fines, when they do happen, are material, they are meaningful. There was one in 2017, which was 310k, there was one in 2020, which was 162k. So they're meaningful sums of money. But actually, when you look at the likelihood that something is going to happen, it's a relatively benign environment within New Zealand in terms of risk. But we also need to be aware of what's happening in Australia as well. So remember, you've got the equivalent of Commerce Commission in Australia is obviously being a lot more proactive in the way they just did that internet sweep. You've also got other institutional regulators like the Australian Security and Investments Commission that is now being a lot more vigilant, greater likelihood of being called up, but probably with smaller fines. So the situation we have right now is not necessarily the situation which will continue. But I'm sure Daniel, when he's up here, if anyone's interested in exploring that, will be able to talk to that in much greater depth and knowledge. But the other point, the really important point I want to make here is that yes, legal action is a risk, but it's not the only risk. This is a really important point. It's not the only risk, because what we see globally is that there is a 0.9 correlation. Okay, that's very strong correlation, almost one-to-one connection between the proportion of people who feel that they have been greenwashed and the likelihood that that person will stop purchasing a product because of the impact that that product is having. So that may not play itself through on every individual level. It may not be true that, yes, I've been greenwashed and suddenly I'm going to stop doing that. But there is a very strong case to say that there is a pretty strong linkage between perceptions and action, between mistrust and changed purchase behaviour. There's some pretty strong indications of that. So we also need to understand, well, if this risk is so meaningful, what do we actually mean? What is this? What is this phenomenon we're talking about? And again, we can contrast the legal and the consumer perspectives on this. We know that the Fair Trading Act is actually pretty black and white. It says that environmental claims must not be misleading or deceptive or unsubstantiated, and they provide some guidance for marketers and communicators in this area around the types of things actions that you should aspire to. But, when you move from legality into psychology, the rules change. And so really it's not a matter when we're thinking about why is it that a consumer may choose to not trust me or to be cynical about what they're receiving from me. Why is that? And so here what we've described something quite different. We're not saying this is legal guidance. We're describing these as signifiers of integrity. Or, if you get them wrong, signifiers of mistrust. These are the things that if you do them, you're more likely to have an audience that frankly doubts or suspects what you're saying. And the types of issues that we're talking about here are claiming that something is sustainable when actually all you're really doing is just making the problem a little less worse than it was before. Now that's a challenge for some industries because that's what's real for them, but it doesn't mean that there aren't examples of consumers calling them up for that. It's referencing milestones that are not so distant and intangible as to be effectively meaningless. It's about, not surprisingly, not claiming something that isn't true. And whether intended or unintended, yes, it still happens. It's about the use of comparative statements and making sure that you actually have something to compare to as opposed to just comparing your own credentials to nothing at all. It's about the use of imagery, and it's about the use of words that are ambiguous. So I'm going to take you through some examples of what we mean to try and get this across in a little more depth. So first of all, let's look at this example from a campaign that Lufthansa ran in 2022. And quite clearly, through their use of imagery, they were inferring a degree and a scope of environmental benefit from some of the changes they were making that is actually non-representative of the environmental impact of an airline. And not surprisingly, they got called up on it. Having accountable milestones, how many of these have we seen? Maybe it's us, maybe it's other things we see. But the challenge with things like this is that while they may be technically correct, they are so far in the distance as to virtually extinguish obligation on the part of the promise maker and at best become wallpaper to the person that hears it, at best. And of course, there is also the issue of just straight old honesty. This was a really interesting example. I don't know if you can read on that necktie on the Fiji water bottle. It says carbon negative, globally positive. Well, it is carbon negative if you use a very interesting and creative carbon accounting system called forward crediting, which allows you to credit yourself with future carbon credits taken sometimes decades in advance and claiming them now. Legally, that may or may not be okay. In terms of how people interpret that and judge it, is it a driver of cynicism or integrity? You guys can judge that for yourself, and I think a lot of people would. Here are some other examples. That one on the left is an ad from Tesco a couple of years ago. They're promoting their plant chef range, and they make a really common and such an easy statement to make. It's even better for the planet. Great. What's it better than? Is it better than what we sold last month? Is it better than the other plant-based? Is it better than beef? Is it better than chicken? Is it better than something that's regeneratively grown or organically grown? Who knows? Who really knows? And so comparisons without comparisons to anything are inherently problematic. And then in these last two examples, we've got some just lovely classical case studies of good old-fashioned nature rinsing. Because in both cases here, with Mercedes' launch of its EV and the HSBC's campaign in Europe and the UK around its investment in sustainable and ethical businesses, both of them overtly used nature imagery in such a way as to provide an impression of the business that was wholly non-representative of its larger impact. And in fact, with the HSB case, that was quite high profile and one which resulted in a fine. Because actually, it's true, they are providing over $1 trillion worth of loans. But they're also doing a whole lot of other things to support fossil fuel industries at the same time. So you've got this interesting dynamic of greenwashing by omission. It's not always about what you say being wrong, it's about what you don't say being incomplete. And then this last one I think is as interesting as all of them, and it's great that we've got some New Zealand data to look at for this question around using ambiguous common terms. So here we've got a term like, if something was labelled compostable, well, what would you expect that to be? And here we have quite a dominant definition. Most people understand, just under 70% understand that compostable means, well, it can be composted at home. So it's nice that at least it has a definition that most people can cohere around. The fact that that doesn't align in any way with the technical advice given by the Ministry for the Environment and actually how compostable these things are in a typical home composting environment is a shame. But there are plenty of examples of this, and net zero is a great one. This is quite different, because here it's not like there's one incorrect definition that everyone's kind of clustering around. Here, actually, it's very clear that people don't know what it means at all. There's just a complete cluster of definitions. And in fact, the equal highest answer here is, I don't know. And here's another example of what I was just talking about with the Tesco Plant Chef example. If a product was described as greener or environmentally friendlier, this is the comparison without a comparate. Then what does it mean? And here, this is New Zealand consumers telling us they don't know what it means either, because you're split almost 50-50 consistently down the middle between, well, actually it means you're greener than competitors or it's greener than what you used to be before. And so if we're in a position where we use ambiguous terms, whether intentionally or otherwise, it's hard to argue that we're not somehow leveraging or benefiting from that ambiguity. So, there's a lot going on under the hood of greenwashing. There's a lot of examples of how it comes to life. There's a lot of really genuinely challenging pitfalls as to how brands and businesses end up with communications that generate mistrust and cynicism as opposed to integrity. What I'd like to do is just bring everything that we've talked about today together, and then we'll start transitioning onto the Q&A, in which case Nikki, Daniel and Jay will come up, but also we'll have a chance for everyone to discuss some questions of their own as well. So, in summary, let's bring together the main thoughts of what was shared with you today. If you're thinking about who your target consumer is, think about the ecoactive. Because even if they're not necessarily your dominant segment now, they sure will be soon. Because across the market, they are now the single highest segment, and they, unlike the other segments, they continue to grow quite measurably. The need to balance value with values remains a central challenge to households as it does to businesses. And within the reality of your own constrained cost environment, the extent to which you can support your consumers to do that is something that will be very, very appreciated. And you can remind yourself, think about the size of that values action gap that we looked at. We've got well over half of the country that are saying, I aspire to do something, I'm this interested, but I'm just not there. So remind yourself, and also remind the people around you where you work every day, that doing the right thing is an opportunity to grow. These things are not opposites anymore, and we don't have to see them as opposites anymore. Thinking about reputation, got a kind of baseline ingoing assumptions which we need to be realistic about. I expect you to be transparent. I expect you to have an active voice. I expect you to treat your staff well and balance what's important to you with what's important to me. But that other assumption that we need to go in is that you probably don't believe me. You probably don't believe me when I'm talking, and that is the starting point, which is actually more accurate. But never, never forget that when you do and when you get it right, it works and it has genuine, measurable, emotional and commercial benefit for you when you do it. And just thinking about greenwashing more specifically, as we just touched on, think about the idea of your messaging chain. Where does it start and where does it end? And how do we ensure that everyone along that chain is informed and articulate regarding what it is you want to say and how it is that you want to say it? Because frankly, the legal risk, the reputational risk, the commercial consumer risk combined is just too great to get it wrong. And when we think about how do I not get it wrong, well, there's some obvious legal guidance, but there's also some basics of consumer psychology that we can apply here as well. Claim meaningful, honest, positive actions and impacts. But don't get clever and don't get lazy with the way that we use comparisons, with the way that we use imagery, with the way that we use common terms of phrase that we know, or perhaps should know, or certainly do know after today, that not everyone understands consistently. And the last point I want to leave you with is a really important one. Don't feel the pressure to be perfect. There's so many brands that try to be impenetrable. We are so perfect that no one in the Twitterverse could possibly damage me. But actually, when you talk to your mainstream consumer, that's not the way to get through to them. Because all it is just finding out the truth in waiting. It's going to happen. The question is whether or not you tell them or whether or not they tell you. And you'd much rather be in that first situation than the second one. So being on a journey is something that makes you relatable and trustworthy because consumers are on that same journey themselves. Remember, they all want to do the same thing, right? They all want to be better, but they're not getting there. You guys want to be better, and they already know you're not getting there. So just be realistic about it. Just be honest about it and share like a human would to them, and they will trust you a lot more. So I've thrown a lot at you quickly, and I appreciate that. So take a breather for a minute. I'm just going to share just a few little things about the evolution of the broader Better Futures program before we move on to the Q&A. You may remember that there were 20 businesses that were involved in that study. We do have data, particularly which enables us to deep dive into any of those. So if you are one of those businesses and you're interested in purchasing some more insight on that, obviously come and talk to us because that data is very much available. But a couple of other things that I think are exciting to talk about. And it does talk to the fact that Better Futures is 15 years old, as Sarah mentioned, and needs to keep on growing up and needs to keep on evolving and changing for your challenges. We can't keep on doing the same thing. Last year, for the first time, we did a more advanced extension study that we call Better Futures 2.0. And that was a syndicated study among SBC members that looked more specifically into those key opportunities for closing that values action gap within your category. So it's a lot more commercially usable information. And we also explored the idea of your tone of voice and your sustainability personality and how we bring that to life in a way that's emotionally resonant with your overall brand and business perceptions. So that's something we'll be coming out to people with in the next few months. If you're interested, that's a conversation we can have at the time. But again, there's one more piece, and I think this is the one I'm probably the most excited about talking about, because I think certainly for the last 2 or 3 years, the conspicuous absence of having more detailed thought leadership in terms of social sustainability has been really obvious to us. And so this year what we're going to be working on developing, again with Jay and Robert and the team at the SBC, is something we're calling Better Futures Thrive. And it's an attempt to start to share a lot of the same insights, but focusing more on the S in ESG. So we're going to be understanding your businesses and your brands in their role as employers, as brand marketers, as purchasers of goods, as sellers and manufacturers of goods, but also as community supporters. So again, expect to hear more from us as the year progresses and as we evolve and try and meet the challenges of your businesses and consumers as they do evolve. So that's the end of the presentation as such. I think it's a nice time to invite Jay, Daniel and Nikki up to the stage to keep me company here on the chairs, and let's kick in to some questions. You guys a moment to settle, and thank you everyone. So when you registered on the website for today, a number of you gave suggestions for some questions that you wanted to talk to or have answered. So we're going to start off with some of those. We'll see how we go for timing. And then, where is Michaela with her roaming mic? Michaela with her roaming mic. If anyone wants to ask some questions directly, then we'll make that happen as well. So, guys, are we ready?
Thank you. That was incredible. Like, best ever, Jason. Like, so much data in there.
There's so much information. Definitely.
And less depressing than last year, slightly.
Yeah. Well, there was only one way to go, right? So I'm going to start with a question for Jay. The report talked about, in this case it was eco-actives, there were 93% of them, but it was like 71% of consumers overall. They're quite interested in sustainability. This comes back to the values action gap, right? Mm-hmm. People are saying they're interested in sustainability, but there's more we could do. So from a business's perspective, what does that opportunity look like? What is this big opportunity that I keep on telling you is here?
Great question. Obviously, it's been more Taylor Swift, but if I was to build on that, I'd say it's a lot of what's already been outlined this morning, which is around meeting the needs of that growing set of conscious consumers who really care about this stuff and want to do more, just aren't quite sure how to go about it and want to make sure they're getting value for money when they do that. So meeting those needs, as Jace has articulated, is such a huge opportunity for growth for businesses as well. And I think that's a really important lever for having conversations internally with other colleagues when explaining what the business case for engaging in this space is. It's not just about doing the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing. There are strong economic returns to come off the back of this as well. I'd like to see businesses continuing to lead in this space and bake sustainability into their core operating models and their way of being and their strategies, because everything flows from there, including authentic and transparent communication. If you've got evidence to back up the claims that you're making, it puts you in a really good position to be connecting with consumers, particularly those that are on the more cynical side. So your leadership and communicating authentically, transparently, and being clear about where your business is on the journey, because there are lots of pain points, shall we say, in embedding sustainability in an organisation. And it's okay that there are pain points, and it's good to be transparent about the fact that you haven't necessarily solved everything, but that you're making progress on various areas that are material to your business.
Excellent. Thank you, Jay. Nikki, here's one which I think might land with you quite well. So what evolution have you seen in sustainability communications over, well, whatever you say, 5 years, 10 years, whatever scope you're thinking of? Mm-hmm. How has the nature of talking about communications and business credentials evolved over time?
I think it has changed quite substantially. I think in the early days when we were getting started, we were working with EcoStore, for example, and I remember looking at their category in that sort of laundry category or dishwash, that kind of thing. There's so much symbolism. I don't know if you guys remember, there was like the dolphins and there was all those things on packagings which were just saying, please buy me because I'm better for the environment, but really no substantiation. And what's changed, if I look at that same category, is the certifications, right? Eco-Choice, Aotearoa, Toitu, is B Corp. There's more ways for consumers to navigate categories, and I think FMCG probably does that incredibly well. And then I think it's harder if you're B2B and you're communicating a certification to another business, right? You've got to find other ways to tell that story to raise it up. But I think also the channels of communication have changed substantially. Obviously, we're in a bit of a crisis here, right, with the media and impact of that on storytelling, democracy as we know it. But the channels are there. There's broad social media opportunities, other ways to promote your messaging. There's collaboration happening between brands and retailers. I can see a lot of opportunity actually, and we know also that a lot of companies now are reporting a lot more on their back of house, if you like. So a lot more, there's animated videos. We're seeing companies get quite creative about how they engage their own people internally. So I think there's been an evolution of less symbolism, more substance, and a broader range of channels in which to reach your audiences.
Great, thank you. Daniel, you're involved in monitoring a lot of what's happening offshore in the greenwashing space. It would be good to hear a little bit from you around what trends and insights do you think maybe you're seeing offshore that perhaps might start to impact us here?
Sure, thank you, Jason. So there's sort of three main trends that I was going to touch on today, some of which we have seen on the slides already. So the first is the trend in relation to green halo claims. So 100% factually true claims which nevertheless present a misleading picture about the overall impact of a business on the planet and the transition to a low-carbon economy. So that's the headline claim. It's been driven very heavily by the UK's ASA and picked up by regulators around the world. And we certainly will see that hitting here in terms of claims of interest. The second sort of category is in relation to transition plans and net zero targets and where people are on the journey. So there has been over the last few years a strong temptation to release emissions reduction targets, say, hey, look, we're creating a sustainable future, we're on the journey, etc. And those sorts of statements get you in trouble if you don't have a substantiated basis or reasonable pathway to get there. You don't have to have solved perfectly how you are going to get to your net zero target on that pathway, but you need to be clear about the assumptions and the dependencies that sit underneath that. And if you don't, you potentially face trouble. 2 nights ago, KLM lost their case in the Netherlands about their Fly Responsibly, Create a Sustainable Future campaign, where the court basically said progress is too slow on SAF in order to substantiate that kind of claim. You're presenting a misleading picture about how quickly and how easily you are moving on the pathway to a sustainable aviation future. And the third point that I'd pick up on is this focus on social media and small print and the effectiveness of small print, or see the link in our bio sorts of claims in social media. And because when you're talking about green claims and substantiation, it can be hard to convey that in an Instagram post in a way that isn't misleading or leaves things out or just gets a soundbite. And so I think there always needs to be a moment of pause and reflection of, is this even a claim that we can make through this channel? Or do we need to do it a different way? Do we need to have a longer form video? Do we need to have an interview series? Do we need something other than just a snappy headline? So those are the sort of 3 main things that we're seeing.
Excellent, thanks.
Can I just also point a
please
great
do.
example, because I can see Think Step in the audience, and they've done a brilliant job with just that, the SBT for Concrete New Zealand, and I think that's a really wonderful example. If anyone wants to see best practice, how to tell that science-based target story with meaningful work plan supporting it, that's a great example locally.
Excellent, that's a nice shout out. And I think let's stick with both Nikki and Daniel, because I think you possibly might both have a perspective on this.
Harsh, Jace, but fine.
Yeah, I know. I was going to crack
It's silent partner.
joke, but I'm not going to.
I think we've done that metaphor.
So fear, green hushing, fear of green hushing. What is it that's going to get me over the line? What's our advice here for how I navigate that fear and that caution? What's the best way forward? Whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, I feel for companies at the moment because it's a genuine fear. I see it in the faces of clients that I work with, and there's a lot of nervousness, right, about the legal implications predominantly, but also very cognizant that that reputational risk is actually possibly more of a concern. So I think, honestly, we need to accept that we are talking to a cynical audience, and that if your competitors are watching, right? So if you're a first mover and you're putting yourself out there, you can be sure that your competitors are probably looking for a way to bring you down. And that's unfortunate, but that's the reality for a lot of corporate companies. So you do have to be bulletproof. I think you absolutely have to get your ducks in a row. You cannot go out before you're ready to go out. When you do go out, make sure that you actually, if you're putting out say a campaign, that you are making sure that it's got all the evidence backing it up and clearly signalled somewhere in that copy so that people can go and find it easily. Web tiles, it's just really tricky, as you said, Daniel, to just do a small post and expect someone to know what that means. I had a case recently where a client, it was almost ready to publish, and it was actually their advertising agency that just quickly check with our agency to make sure that it was kosher, and it was not. It was very misleading, but it had gone through a lot of approval process internally, but there was just not that, let's just really sense check this objectively. So that's a big one. I just think you do have to be brave. I really feel for some companies at the moment who are under the microscope because they are first movers and their competitors are not doing as much. And I just think we're in a transitionary period. We want to help people navigate the transition and take all their consumers with them. So they're going to have to explain that we are in a transition and this is what we can do right now. Here's what it means. So it's just being really transparent. But please don't stop communicating to your consumers because they have those aspirations. They want to keep up.
So from my perspective, there's a whole range of themes that come out of that. One, directors and boards really are feeling the litigation risk around greenwashing and the reputation risk around it. But sort of the conversations that we have with those boards and the management and in-house counsellors, we always want to encourage organisations to be bold and ambitious and take leadership in this space and not feel that they can't tell their story because of a greenwashing or a litigation risk. I never want to have a client who feels that they have to just keep quiet because it's all too hard. Because as we've gone through some of the themes today, it is about talking about progress rather than perfection. And you can do it. You can communicate effectively. And there are multiple international examples of organisations which have come out, have made claims in this sort of space, and then had to change the messaging because things have changed. And so there are ways that you can do that that doesn't result in immediate legal risk. Nestle changing from their carbon neutral to net zero and focusing on absolute emissions reductions. Lego saying that they were going to switch to bioplastics, spent 2 years trying to investigate 600 different compounds. All of them were worse for the environment than virgin plastic. And they came out and communicated that and said, yes, it's hard, but we're going to keep trying. So a lot of this comes down to something that Joe Longo, the chair of ASIC, said this week, which was, it's hard being a director, but that's not going to change. You've just got to sort of lean into the difficulty and, as you say, Nikki, get the ducks in the row. And the only sort of other legal point or legal risk that I would add in is that by hushing or staying silent or not taking action in this space, then you run another legal risk, which is you run the risk of shareholder activism, you run the risk of directors' duties claims brought against you for not moving quick enough, for not having a clear or sufficient transition plan to get you where you need to go. So just staying silent won't absolve you of legal risk. You've just got to do it right and do it properly.
Right. Excellent. Thanks, guys. Great answers. Jay, just a thought. So Daniel was just mentioning the idea of shareholder activism or something that could be a risk that might come from choosing to communicate less or choosing to, be less forthcoming. But what are the other reasons why we think businesses should be communicating here? What are the reasons behind it? Why is it a good thing?
I think that's what builds on one of the points that Daniel's made, which is it's almost worse to say nothing at all, because I think people fill the space with their own stories, and that's come out in the data today. So I think being able to be authentic and real about the issues that your company is engaging with and where you're taking a leadership position, but where you've still got room to grow, I suppose, is really critical. One of the reasons I like working for the Sustainable Business Council is that we see such a broad spectrum of businesses at all stages in their journeys, but they're all in membership together so that they can continue to challenge one another and inspire one another. And I think by some businesses being quite vocal in what they're communicating, it almost lifts the floor for other businesses and encourages them to do the same. So I think that piece around inspiration and storytelling can be really transformative. So I have doffed my cap to the businesses that do put themselves out there, because I think it's really important for the business community as a whole, and it's really important for consumers as well, because businesses are ones sending the signals to consumers. It's like a virtuous cycle. They're signalling to them what good looks like from a sustainable product and service perspective, and then back from consumers to business too.
So we need to be brave, and there are benefits to doing so. So on the basis of the conversations that we've had this morning, and this question again I think is open to all of you, what are those key points that we would want to talk about? And this is going to vary a lot from client to client, from category to category, but if there's any key themes that are resonating with you guys, what are those things that we would come out and be saying?
I think there's a real opportunity for businesses to communicate around social sustainability issues. I mean, we've seen today that they make up the top 5 issues that are front of mind for consumers. So how are you treating your people? How are you engaging with your supply chain to make it more ethical? How are you engaging meaningfully with your community? Because I think for those who are new to sustainability, they might associate it just with engaging with the environment, and I feel like you can build a positive reputation around your business by talking to how that turns up in a social space too, and then building on that to talk about the other environmental aspects, of which there are various degrees of confusion around net zero composting. We had an interview with NBR this week, and even the journalist was asking us, so can I put this plastic bag in my home composting, or will that not compost? So there you go. She is a veteran of the sustainability journalism space. If she's asking those questions, others are too. So being transparent, articulate, and focusing on what's front of mind for consumers, which is often the social sustainability issues, is really key.
I like focusing on the social as a way in to employees as well for internal comms. Yeah. One of our clients, Unilever, they're doing this trial for 4-day work week, right? And they're trialling it here in New Zealand and Australia. And rather than just focusing on storytelling at a corporate level, which we do as well, it's getting down to that user-generated content. So employees in the business. I mean, TikTok is where most of these people under 40 are hanging out, right? So, I mean, communication only happens when you actually talk to someone and they actually hear you. Mm-hmm. So it's really important that you are choosing channels where your audience and your consumers are. So in that instance, a user-generated day in the life reel of someone working at a business, you can show content like, look at my fair trade snacks in my drawer next to my desk, look at my method recycling bins, look at my plants. I mean, it's just keeping it real. And I think what I loved about the conversation this morning was the little practical things that people are doing in their own homes. We had had a conversation about solar and what we're doing there and the finance options available. Some of the banks have got interest-free loans at the moment. So looking at celebrating, I want to keep us focused on being positive in our communications because we know that will help take people with us. So really giving them practical examples of what we're doing. And I see that on LinkedIn all the time, people sharing, we're celebrating this success in this area of sustainability. So I'd encourage businesses to get their people talking, don't just think it has to be the CEO doing a press conference. It can be someone in your team doing a reel for TikTok, and that's totally valid, and it might actually be more impactful. So, yeah.
In the couple of minutes we've got left, the one thing that I wanted to pick up from the slideshow earlier was that consumer cynicism point, and that concept of brands playing in areas where consumers don't think they have a sort of right to contribute or otherwise. And it picks up with some of the social points too, is that I always think brands and organisations should start with their core product and service and tell the sustainability story of their core product and service, because for so long it's like, oh yes, well, not to pick on this particular example, but we have a tree planting day, and so therefore that means it offsets all of the carbon emissions that we're pumping out, etc. So if you focus on telling the story of your core business, then you're not in a position where consumers going, oh, you're putting a fig leaf on the impact of your business by saying that you do some tree planting or something else, which is a sort of side tack on. So yeah, start with core business first.
That's a really good point, Daniel. And just a few days ago, we were discussing another example of the point that Daniel was making. It's not just a matter of, what makes sense for your business, but sometimes it's a matter of what makes sense for the category you work in. There was an example a few years ago that we were talking about where Brewdog, the brewer in the UK, put out a product that was championing the gender pay gap. It was basically pink beer that was selling 20% cheaper in bars to make people aware of the income gap between men and women in the UK. And very well intentioned, but it just crashed. And a big part of that is because people associate the alcohol category with issues like physical health, mental health, violence against women, And these are the things that they want to see alcohol brands addressing, not otherwise very, very excellent and virtuous causes like the difference in pay, but it just didn't work for that company at all. It's not what they want them to be doing. And so that sense of alignment is really important. Okay, thanks guys. That was most appreciated. Should we put it out to, it didn't take long. Good question. If somebody wants a microphone, Michaela's on the way with one. If you feel like shouting out, then you're more than welcome to do that too.
I can shout. Hi, Adam from Airways. I was quite concerned in the report around the climate change perceptions really dropped, and I'm a big fan of words of power, and I always frame it the climate crisis. So internal comms, I always put internal climate crisis, and externally we're looking about should we start using the term climate crisis instead of climate change, which I think is the perception. So my question is, do you agree we should be using the term climate crisis instead of climate change? And if so, how do we get the Better Futures report using climate crisis and all the other businesses in their reports using, just so we get a general change in the general consumer market, so it puts the importance about what we're trying to deal with here?
That's great. I wholeheartedly agree, and I think it's very powerful when you hear people in positions of power calling it what it is, climate emergency, climate crisis. It's very powerful, and it sends a signal to everyone in that business, and then those people go home and they talk to their family, whānau, their community engagement. I mean, it's quite powerful. I think the language use is really important.
And then, sorry.
No, you go.
And then the role is then for businesses to back that up with talking about what they're doing about that, because I think there's a risk with using the words like crisis and emergency that feels hopeless, and that's not the message I want consumers to walk away with. I want them to walk away with, yes, it is an emergency, yes, it needs to be front of mind, yes, we need to take action now, and here are the 3 things that we're doing to do so.
And the way I would share some thoughts in response to what you were saying, which is a great question, what we're seeing is perhaps a reduction in the singularity of climate change as an issue. That doesn't mean we're seeing a reduction in the intensity of climate change as an issue. And those are 2 different things. What we're saying is that now, people are increasingly aware of the network effects between one environmental and social cause and another, and that just brings more issues up and more issues into people's consideration, and particularly among the eco-actives, that's what we're seeing. So I don't think they're any less aware. The awareness of climate change is still one of the most defining profile differences between an eco-active and another segment. So it's still very much alive. It's just that there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on at the same time. So no, I don't think that's a reason to change your language, no.
Kia ora, Kat McDonald from Proxima. The word that kept bubbling up for me during that presentation is the word balance. And I think from a kind of sustainability reporting point of view, as a principle, it's probably the most poorly done piece. And a lot of this about greenwashing and green hushing is all around how to tell a good story, a good claim. What's often, I think as well, driving that kind of cynicism is companies just aren't really good at talking about the truth of what's bad. And so how do they sort of step into actually saying, we are doing good here? Is that a genuine good, or is it offsetting a whole lot of harm over here? And start to be able to front up and talk genuinely about the bad stuff?
Yeah, you can never be brave enough in this space, right? And we talk about warts and all reporting. When we're briefing clients on reporting, it's always that concept of what is material, making sure that it is complete, that it has balance, and it's just that there's so much nervousness around disclosing things that are maybe industry-wide issues. So why should we own it if it's an industry-wide? It's not just us, we don't see our competitors talking about it. Why should we take that on? Very challenging conversations, but I think it's very important that they get told in stakeholder language as well, so you can bring in some balance in a reporting context. If you interview a third-party stakeholder and that's their perspective, put that in there. Or if you have a sustainability council or committee on the board, if they're putting in some context, that's quite a useful mechanism for making companies braver and providing that balance in the report without it being in the chair or CEO's statement per se. There's ways of doing it, but I agree that's such a challenge, such a challenge.
And building on Nikki's reflections, I think for me, good communication, what a great example of bad communication. Good communication is also good engagement, and it is a two-way dialogue. And as businesses evolve and are more mindful of the wider range of stakeholders in which they need to have touch points with, I think that's where some of those conversations turn up. It does need to turn up in reporting, it needs to turn up in how you talk to the media and publicly, but it also needs to turn up in honest conversations with your employees, your businesses that you're procuring from, your other organisations in your ecosphere.
And Kat, just one further reflection. The point that I was making earlier around having the courage to say that we're on a journey, it makes a real difference. It makes you more relatable. I think it's a very important framing. Yeah, great question. Oh, we have a hand.
Kia ora. I'm really interested in the panel's response to the data that we saw up there around that gap of government and the nexus between the role of government and the role of business in the current climate, and that drive and what we've been called to out of the report around how business can have an active voice in this space.
Great question, Luke.
I can make a start on that. Yeah, it's quite interesting to see the gap between business and the gap between government, and there being similar gaps. When I think about it, I think there's real opportunities, as you say, Lou, to partner with government to shape some of their thinking and messaging. And the way in which to do that, I think, is focusing on the same outcomes as we would normally working in the sustainability profession, but tweaking the language. So we're talking about productivity, efficiency, prevention. Those seems to be the phrases and ways of articulating sustainability that land with the political parties in power at the moment. So I think that language shift is really important. I also think one of the reasons I really like working for Sustainable Business Council, outside of having such a broad membership, is the opportunity for business to be leading regardless of the political ebbs and flows. And there is a momentum behind sustainability at the moment that is unstoppable. And there is a momentum behind even the basic mandated things that businesses are expected to do now that I think sits outside of government. I'm not letting government off the hook. They need to provide the architecture and framework for businesses to be clear about where they can make large-scale investments. But I also think businesses can be collaborating with one another to make some real sector-wide industry shifts as well. So there's, for me, a piece about partnership, a piece about language, and a piece about business-to-business engagement in this space too.
And I think there's a big opportunity for innovation. So perhaps with this government, it's going to be different, right? But maybe what we'll see is a focus more so on, maybe we can become the home of climate tech, and we're exporting that, some agri-tech. I mean, I'm hopeful that we can achieve some good things in the next 3 years under any government, and just focusing on what is going to spin their wheels. So exactly, language is critical, but also if they're focused on economy, okay, well, what's the sustainability opportunity in that? Like there's, they're very open to things that are going to really support our exporters, our manufacturers, and really grow that. It's back to the knowledge wave, isn't it? We need some kind of momentum behind sustainability where we just get everybody excited for this opportunity that New Zealand can become. I mean, I think this is our time. If it's not now, when is it? We've got to seize this moment to really, I guess, look to the economic opportunity that sustainability affords us. Yeah.
I'd also say that business can play a strong role in making the case for what is good regulation. So many of the issues that we see in the sustainable transition are system-wide problems. And how do you overcome a system-wide problem if you've got laggards within a sector, or if first movers are going to be at a competitive disadvantage and a price disadvantage and otherwise? And so there can be a really strong case for business across a sector and through sector organisations to advocate for the regulatory settings and changes that are needed in order to unlock the quite significant step changes we need in some sectors of the economy.
Great thoughts, guys. Hey, I'm conscious of time because obviously some people are starting to slip out. If there's maybe time for one more question before we wrap it up, if anybody wants to... Great. Well, then it sounds like it's time to wrap it up. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming along. I really appreciate it and hanging on there a few minutes longer. It's been obviously a great, broad-ranging conversation, and thank you again to Jay, Nikki and Daniel for all your contribution this morning. And that is the end of this morning, but if anybody wants to hang around for 10 or 15 minutes and chat and discuss, please, you're very welcome to do so, but otherwise, we're done. Hey.